All right, good morning, community members. Thanks for being here this morning. See some faces who I know and some faces who are new to me. My name is Rundle. I'm the superintendent here in the Mercer Island School District. Welcome to those of you who are joining online via Zoom. This morning's event has a live Zoom option as well as in person as well. This is starting my second year as our superintendent. It's my 14th year in our school district. I started off as an elementary principal and then moved to the district office as the director of learning services, assistant superintendent of learning services, and now the superintendent here. Want to really welcome you in, and this is an opportunity for us to give you a culmination of where we are so far, help describe where we are in the process and where we're still headed along the way. Before I start, I do want to just introduce you to some of our staff who are here today. Starting right over here is Brandy Fox. Brandy Fox owns CPM, Construction Project Management. She's our owner representative. If you recognize her, she's worked for the city on projects, she's worked for the school district on projects, and really helps with the facilitation with our different vendors and construction project architects and keeping us on track. In the back, we have Tony Kuhn. He's our Director of Maintenance and Operations. Next to him is Ian Henry. Ian Henry is our Communications Coordinator. Behind, though kind of hiding, is Rachel Hood and Jen Williamson. They both work in our operations and maintenance team as well. And I think I saw Kathy Zarowski. So there's Kathy right there. She also works in our facilities and our capital projects department. Next to Ian back there is Andres Ronzer. He's our Director of Technology, and next to him is RJ Stidham. And then right over here, and I'll introduce Leroy a little bit more. Leroy is here from Mahlum Architects, who's been a partner on this project from the beginning. This morning, what we want to do is spend the first hour or so. It's been hard to keep it to an hour in our presentations, whether or not those have been some truncated ones I've done in some of the schools or even at last night's presentation. And that's because there's a lot of information to go over. We've had a community group who spent close to 20 hours working throughout last spring, and so we're trying to distill down much of the information they had, plus some thoughts that they were having, and that's really what brings us to today. After we have a chance to go through different aspects of our long-range facility plan, then we will have an opportunity for you to give us feedback. We'll have a survey for you to complete today, and some may want to complete it today, some may want to go home. We will have a version of this. It's the same survey. We will have it online. We will also be recording this, and at the end of the recording that we post online, there'll also be QR codes. So we're trying to make it accessible to as many people as possible. And then we'll all be here for Q&A. We have cards, and Brandy has those right back here. If you'd like to take notes along the way, and you want to use a note card and a pen, we have numbered all of our slides down at the bottom, which will allow you to designate which slide we were on, maybe where you had your question, which might be able to help us answer your questions later on. So with that, kind of getting into really anchoring us of where we are and some of our, not just assumptions, but beliefs. I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that we're all here together as a community. This isn't just the Board of Education working in isolation. This isn't just the superintendent and operations and maintenance working in isolation. This is a community conversation. I've been in this district obviously for 14 years. I've seen many projects go very well, and I've also seen ones that didn't go well. We failed bonds in the past in our school district. I was here for one of those, and I think we have plenty of lessons learned. And one of those lessons is a lack of sometimes community engagement, or engaged the community but didn't listen to the specificity of it, and so we have bonds that didn't meet people's expectations. The last thing I want as a community leader and a superintendent is to go down a road that isn't going to be supported by our community. At the end of the day, when we're talking about major bond projects and rebuilding schools, we have to have the support of the community behind us. A bond requires 60% of the voters to pass it, which is a really high number. And with that, we want to make sure that we're engaging with doing that. We also have to remind, and I'd like to remind everyone, we are not at a place of making a decision. These events that we're hosting, being out into some of the schools, meeting with PTA leaders, meeting with community groups side by side with Mahlum and others, this is all part of the process of collecting information so that we can take it back to the school board, we can take it back to our team, and start to assemble of what might our long-range facility plan look like, not just on the bond side, because the bonds build the buildings, but the capital levies that you also helped us pass and to support, they help us maintain them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that importance. I consider us still very early in the process. I know some people have felt that, that things have been sprung on people. And I'll talk a little bit more about those timelines. And it can definitely feel like that. I completely understand that perspective. But I also want to put it in the context that we've really been methodical, and this has been part of the process all along to engage our community. And finally, everything we do up here, welcome the questions. I want it to be transparent, I want it to be honest, and I want it to be an ongoing dialogue that we're having. So getting into this, I think a place that we weren't originally going to start our presentation, but really heard feedback from the community that they really needed to understand where we are in the process, that was creating a lot of anxiety or a lot of unease about, well, you've already made up a decision or you're already 4 steps ahead of us. And so I want to really try to convey to you, I may not convince you or not, but I certainly want to do my best through my actions as well, that we're back down here in the long-range facility planning process. Leroy will talk a little bit about what that process entails and why we do that, but we're back down here in October of 2023. I'm going to go right up here to hypothetical. I can't emphasize hypothetical enough because I have 5 bosses called the school board, and the last thing I need to do is get out ahead of them because they're elected officials by you, and they have to make some important decisions. But it is important for me to say, hypothetically, what might a bond scenario look like? And I paint this because you can see that even in a pretty fast pace, we're talking 2028 before students would possibly be moving into a new school if we were to rebuild one, if that were to be the case. And the reason why it takes that long is that we would have to be somewhere a year from now where the board would be in a place where they would be actually thinking about putting something on the ballot. And then we'd be talking February of 2025, nearly a year and a half from now before it would even be on the ballot. And then after that, we have to go through all the design and permitting and construction. Another way to look at this would be to say, that's a pretty fast-paced scenario. That's about as fast as we could move, and probably unlikely to be able to even go that quickly, given the complexities of what we're working on. But if we look here at another option, we could say, well, we know we have bonds that will be expiring from the 2013-14 bond in 2019-2020. And so if we're thinking about maybe running those more concurrently, and we'll talk about that, we might spend more time in engagement and study, and it might be spring 2026 before the board starts making some more firm decisions about what they want to see in the bond. It would be October 2026 where we'd be talking about a ballot measure, 2027 perhaps a vote, and then we'd be talking clear out to 2030. Again, this is completely hypothetical, and I want to emphasize that again. It's just to give you a picture of this is what the processes look like along the way. Right back here in that orange is where we are, and if we drill down, this is the drilled down version of that orange right there. So as we look at this, we did our original long-range facility planning process, or our most recent one in 2019-2020. As we went through that process, and Leroy will talk about this, COVID hit, and it really truncated that entire process and actually cut it short. When I was hired as the school board, one of the requests from the school board, and I shared that same sentiment, was we need to pick that long-range facility plan back up, and we need to continue the conversation with our community partners, and really make a plan for the future. When we picked it up last fall, things were very different from a demographic standpoint. Demographic trends are changing across the region and across the state and across the country. So we hired 2 demographers. We used our longtime demographer, EDS. They've been doing demographic studies for Mercer Island School District for many years. But our board, much like you want a second opinion sometimes when you're receiving a diagnosis or you're working with a doctor, we also had another firm run a concurrent long-range facility plan to run alongside. And so we were able to take both of those to try to get the best information possible for what we might see in the next 3, 5, and 10 years in our school district in terms of our student population. Meanwhile, as the demographic study was going, we were assembling a committee of community members to help us. On that committee were members from all of our schools. We had members whose kids already came through the schools and have moved on, but they still live in our community. We had family members or parents of kids who aren't even in our schools yet, and to try to represent a wide range of opinions. We held 6 different meetings between April and September. The first one being in April, 2 more in May, 2 more in June, and then the one that we had when the school year was starting. The critical part was at the end of June. That's when we took all of the different meetings and all of the information that was shared and discussed and put forward by the committee, and we assembled that into a presentation. And that presentation went to our school board in late August at their second board meeting in August. And that gave us a chance to check in with the board to make sure that we're on the right track, that the proposals that we have are ones that we could continue to engage in. And then the direction from there, and my proposal to them was, it was our opportunity now to go back into the community and have meetings like we're having today. And so what you're seeing today are proposals that came out of our committee. I am tremendously grateful for the 30+ community members who participated. We had over 20 hours of meetings, as I said, and they were an integral part. And what they put forward aren't the things that Fred Rundle feels like we should do, or that Leroy Landers feels like we should do, or the board feels like we should do. They are, here are some possibilities based on everything we've seen that we think the community should start considering. And so we're bringing those forward, and though while kind of an outsider to the committee, I definitely stand by the committee's work and all of their opinions, but I don't have an endorsement for you here. I really want to start engaging and hearing from you. We have many more months ahead of us in terms of more planning and engagement and communications, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that here. I want to assure that everyone knows that we are committed to facilities that reflect the values of our community, and they support academic learning, and they are great places for educators to want to be. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that they're going to fit the needs of our students. And our decisions start with our students, and they end with our students. But we know that people have different values of what they want to see in a school. Some want their schools to be resemble what they see when they go to soccer games over in neighboring school districts, and that's important. And others want to see that it has facilities that their students' unique needs can be met in. And what we try to do is think about, okay, at first, before we even get to that point, we have to think about, do we need a new building? Do we need new facilities? Do we need to upgrade them? And that's what our plan is really set to do. So looking at our facilities that we have right now, obviously right down here, I'll start with Northwood. Northwood's our newest elementary school, and the 7 represents it's 7 years old. We haven't done any renovations to it. We haven't done any upgrades to it. It's in essentially its original condition. And that's the same is true over here for one portion of Islander Middle School. Then what you see in the other bars are much taller bar graphs representing the age of our facilities of Lake Ridge, West Mercer, Island Park, half of the middle school, our high school, our administration building, and some of our other assets as a community. The green represents when the building was built till its first major renovation. So we did do major renovations in the mid-90s to Island Park, Lake Ridge, West Mercer, the high school, and the middle school. That was part of a bond package. There was original talk in our community back then about a bond that would rebuild schools. The community felt that that was too soon, and then we did major renovations to all of those schools. And so since then, we have 29 to 30 years, or 26 in the case of Crest, since we've done any major renovations. We've been able to maintain our buildings to the state that they're in, and they do look pretty amazing for the age that they are because of the cap tech levy, and using capital dollars to repair a roof or put on a new roof or add walls or subtract walls and to do some infrastructure improvements. But that renovation back in the mid-90s, that was not tearing out all the pipes and electrical fixtures and everything. Those are still all originals, which is why we're starting to have the conversation around our facilities are at a point where either we need to invest a lot of money into them on the capital side and the cap tech side, or we need to be thinking about rebuilding. As I was in a meeting just before this one this morning and hearing from one of the council members, that big surge, and we'll show a graph here in a moment, but that big surge of population after the bridge opened back in the 40s, and they put in the floating bridge, that big surge in population caused massive growth, and that's when we were building these schools. That's when the city was building their city halls. We're all at that kind of same place where we're at the point where either they've outlived their life now, or we feel like we can renovate. A couple of examples of that. I think sometimes what you see when you walk in our schools, and we get a lot of compliments from people who come in to do our studies on our schools, is they say for as old as they are really in good shape, especially from the outside perspective. You get behind the walls and we do have some things that we know we need to improve. We also have out on our playgrounds and our covered areas that we're at that point where we need to invest. And that's what this process is about, is how to do that, when to do that, and what dollars are going to help us with that process. From a programmatic standpoint, we do have facilities that were designed with these really long hallways in our 3 existing schools. West Mercer and Island Park have the best flow. They kind of have those rectangular or square configurations, but you still have these long hallways, which in my opinion, does make it challenging when you're talking about pulling kids out into hallways and working with them. I think we've done an amazing job with that. We have some amazing educators, but I think there's other ways that we can configure our schools. But from an elementary perspective, and as a former principal, one of the great challenges, which we changed when we opened Northwood, is things like having a gymnasium that's the same as your cafeteria. That definitely works, and it's a great use of space. Where it becomes a really big challenge is when you're scheduling special education services, ELL services, other intervention services for our students, because that amount of time gets eaten away by when kids have to be either at PE or they have to be at lunch. And so those are some minor things that don't always seem apparent, but they become challenges. And then down at our middle school, having 3 separate buildings has been a challenge over time versus having one cohesive building. When we look at other school districts in and around the region, we start looking at students per square feet, which is what this is measuring, area per student. Our schools, Lake Ridge, Island Park, and West Mercer, we definitely have a smaller amount than what's being built in many of our neighboring districts who have seen growth and have been able to build new schools because they've had lots of land. Not being a district that benefits from that, you can see with Northwood, we did take that into consideration. The one note on Northwood, you see the dotted lines at the top. We put in a competition gymnasium at Northwood so that our high school could actually use that for some of their 9th grade teams in basketball and volleyball. And so that because of its proximity to the high school, that wouldn't necessarily be done in other schools to build a competition, a full gymnasium. But that's what that notes there. But you can see that just in terms of square footage, our schools, which weren't built, which were built at a very different time, have a different look. The next graph then starts to look at when we're starting to think about capacity and how many students can our schools hold. This was a major conversation back before we built Northwood. If you were here in that time, we had our schools quite crowded, and I'll show you some numbers here in a second on that. They certainly felt crowded because those schools weren't built for 600 and close to 700 students is where we were getting. They were built for more of the 450 to 500. So in the teal there is the existing permanent capacity. That's the number of students that if we used every classroom the way it was designed and put students in it for classrooms, how many students could we hold from a permanent capacity standpoint? We can also add in then a little bit more using our portables, and obviously in the early, kind of when I was into the district, 2009 through 2015-16, we had portables in all 3 schools. They were going up and down playgrounds, they were covering hardscape, they were behind at Island Park, behind where the multi-purpose room is, and that was really to deal with the surge in capacity and the fact that we only had 3 elementary schools at the time. If you look at our current enrollment there in that light orange, you can see that our current capacity available in our schools is higher than the number of students that we have currently in our elementary schools. Finally, on the far right there, we have our projected enrollment. I'll come back to it. What I want to point out there is that our projected enrollment and current enrollment are obviously pretty similar. So what we're thinking about in our elementary schools is over the next decade, what we have now is kind of what we're going to expect over the next decade. From the utilization standpoint, we've been able to utilize our buildings in different ways than certainly when I was a principal down at Lake Ridge. Being able to have our art classes in classrooms and not on a cart has been a nice thing to have. Being able to have all of our classrooms, or nearly all of them, inside the building and not in portables, that has been a nice thing to have. But at the same time, we also have a lot of opportunity if we want to explore that. And again, this isn't, we'll talk more about this, not being right or wrong, but just being things that we get to make some decisions about. During my tenure in the school district, just thinking about stepping back and saying, what have we done with our schools? It's been pretty amazing, and it's been using capital dollars, as I said, to our levy, and it's been the bond that we passed in 2013-14. But we've been able to add into our music wing at our high school. We've been able to add on extensions in the science classrooms. We built an extension going to the east on the end of the high school, 200, 100, and 300 hallways. We've done some things with our Performing Arts Center. We obviously used the bond to build 1.5 schools, essentially, and then a little bit on the high school. Using CAP dollars, we've done turf replacements, we've done security upgrades, we put on new roofs in certain places, and so we've been able to kind of parcel together different funding mechanisms and use them in the best way to keep our schools safe, supportive, and obviously operational for our students. Just recently, we've done some upgrades in our high school. We built in infrastructure in our transportation lots for our EV buses. And so we will continue to do many of these things, and Leroy will talk about that a little bit later on. One of the main reasons for our long-range facility plan and why now is a good time is obviously we want to adjust to our new enrollment. We want to make sure that we are planning our facilities for what we think will be the enrollment moving forward. The board always expects the superintendent yearly to provide an update on the facilities. There are times when you're just adjusting the plan and moving along, and then every now and then we need a major change to that. The last major long-range facility plan prior to the one that was truncated by COVID was right before Northwood and Island Middle School were built, and so we're about 10 years out and that's why we're in this process now. We also have some things that have changed. We have the Clean Buildings Act, which was passed by the legislature, which is requiring a minimum standard for efficiencies and clean buildings in our schools. There is an expectation we hit that in the next couple of years in all of our buildings, or there are penalties that we pay on that. And some of the things that are changing rapidly is things like when we built Northwood, the heating system that we put into that doesn't even meet the codes of what we could do today because of the way things changed. We don't have to go in and replace that, but I paint that because things change quickly and we're always subject to new legislative requirements. And lastly, our current bond debt, as I mentioned before, will be sunsetting in the next few years, towards the end of this decade and into the first part of the next one. And so thinking about tax rates and long-term bond rates and whatnot are important. So I want to turn it over to Leroy and have him talk a little bit more. Leroy Landers has been a partner with us, working with Mahlum Architects. There's been some questions certainly in the community about why does a school district partner with a third party vendor or firm, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is transparency is important for me, and I know that it can give the illusion or we could be subject to criticism that if we do all of this internally as a school district, we certainly run the risk of it seeming like we're controlling everything from the beginning. And so that's one reason. Another one is this firm, as well as many others, they do this all over the Pacific Northwest. They have access to resources and perspective from school districts from Oregon all the way into Washington, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and so that greater perspective is really helpful along the way. So with that, I want to introduce you to Leroy Landers, who's going to take a bit of the presentation from here.
Great, thank you, Fred. And firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, taking the time out of your lives to spend a few hours with us. We know there are probably 1,000 other things you can be doing. And I want to emphasize how important hearing from you is for both the district and the school board. And just to reiterate a couple of things that Fred mentioned, we're early in the process. Our objective today is to really try and take probably 16 to 18 hours from the previous planning committee of thinking and talking about that group, add to it 20 more hours from this update, and boil it down into 10 slides or something in view of this time to try and explain some of the things they've been thinking about, talking about, and some of the approaches that they thought might be a good fit from their viewpoint as community members. And what we're trying to do is show you that work so that you can see it, think about it, and say, you know, some of you may say that makes some sense to me, but I think if you did these things, it'd be better. Some of you may say, you know, that doesn't make any sense at all. We need to really rethink this in a big way. Both of those are valid. That's what we want to hear from you. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. A quick overview of our firm. Mahlum has offices in Seattle and Portland, and really one of our prime focuses for over 8 decades of practice has been associated with programming, planning, design, and construction administration for learning environments. And that's been not only K through 12, but pre-K through 12 learning environments, but also post-secondary learning environments, universities, and that sort of thing. So hopefully, you know, our goal is to try and bring our experience to this conversation. We help facilitate it. We really don't have any skin in the game from the standpoint of any advocating for one way or the other. What our goal is to try and help your community outline a long-range facility plan that aligns with your values, okay? Because we know that if it doesn't align with your values, and that's why we want to hear from you today, that you're not going to support it. And if any part of that long-range plan involves capital improvement, where you have to tax yourself, basically, that level of support is critical. Because if you don't like the plan, you feel it doesn't represent you, I'm not going to support it, it's dead in the water. It's a useless piece of paper, Okay, so that's kind of a quick background for that. So with that, I'd like to kind of take a really high-level view of some of the things that we've been talking about and really open up with really what is a long-range plan. Some of you may be thinking, why are we even doing this? What value does it have for us as a community? It has, from our perspective, it has a lot of value. Here are kind of a couple of big things that we think it can really help any district with. One that helps you get your arms around what, if any, facility-related need may exist out there. So that's really kind of these three categories that Fred kind of gave you 3 slides at a high level overview of. So it looks at your facility's ability to accommodate your educational programs. Okay? Are they working for you from the standpoint of supporting your kids' learning? Is there any change that might be made to help support them better? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the individual district. It also tracks your capacity with regard to what your enrollment is and how that's trending over time, projecting over time. And we're well aware that projections are projections. You know, when you're measuring out 2 or 3 years, your projections are probably going to be more accurate. Once you start to get out to 10 years, that crystal ball gets a lot more fuzzy. You know, if we knew exactly what was going to happen in 10 years, we'd all be rich because we predicted the future. And then, of course, it also incorporates the physical condition of your facility, looking at their age, looking at what areas of deferred maintenance might exist. And that's also directly associated with the state assessment that happens using a state assessment form. But really, one of the big things that the long-range plan can do for you is it's really a tool for strategic management of your facilities over time. So this long-range plan is not simply looking at the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. It's really, it has the ability to help you think about your facilities over a longer period of time. School districts are an institution in your community. They don't kind of come and go like a developer building. They're here for 100+ years. They are central to your facility in your school district, and that's you kind of need to be thinking about these things. And so really, they look at whether or not any modernization or addition or replacement, or in some instances, new construction might make sense. And sometimes it makes sense to not do much of anything other than just kind of do maintenance along the way, maintain deferred, and that's good. It's good to know that that's the limit of what you really need to be doing. It also looks at targeting more efficient opportunities with regard to your site and facility use. But the real key thing, which brings me back to why it's so important that you're here, it should create a prioritized plan for your facilities that reflects your values and is really in direct alignment with your ability to support whatever might need to be done with your facilities. And a good way to think about this as we're moving forward is when you look at the age of your facilities, that Fred put up that sort of chart, and you see currently right now, some of them are approaching around 7 years or so. So I would encourage you to be thinking about what we're presenting to you in a 30 or 40 year kind of life cycle, really from now, okay? And be thinking about today, in the view of 40 years, is there anything that makes sense that you should be doing today? If not, that's completely legit, and it's a fine position to take. Our goal is just to get you sort of thinking about that and to share with you what the facility planning committee was discussing. So you've already seen charts that relate to these kind of 3 core areas, the colored circles that you see, and these are really a collection of considerations of facts, you might say, associated with educational services. These are educational programs, and this is just kind of a list of some of the things that are talked about and discussed with regard to programs or potential programs. Are your programs changing? Are they growing? Are they shrinking? And so forth. Enrollment capacity, of course, is another consideration, making sure you have an appropriate balance between those 2 things. And then facility condition, there's just an example of some of the things that are talked about with regard to that. But again, all of those things are really just facts. What really is key is a sort of dotted line around the outside of this bend, which is really what your goals and your vision is for learning at Mercer Island, because that is the thing that informs what you do with these facts, okay? It's what your view is, and that begins to create the long-range facility plan. So, Fred touched on this process already, so I won't, in view of our time, I won't go through it in detail, but it is important to note that we did do previously the planning work, which really served that 2019-2020 planning work, which got cut short by COVID. Conceptually, that served as a basis for the work that we've been doing over the course of 2023. And I'll talk a little bit about how that previous work, which that facility planning committee really put in some important time and good discussion, was validated or verified by the current committee to see if it was still applicable today. I also want to mention just really quickly here, in the previous study from a demographic standpoint, it was a demographic study update, and just because of some of the significant shifts that's happened since COVID, the district actually commissioned 2 demographic studies just to see how 2 separate demographers' findings would compare. And then they looked at those, talked with both demographers, and as best you can, tried to kind of reconcile the 2. And that's been the basis for that part of the data that we've been working with. So with regard to goals and vision, that's really the first thing that we started with in this long-range facility plan, because we were really wanting to find out from the members of your community what they felt was really important from the standpoint of a learning environment, and whether it be existing now and they like it and that's the way they want it to be, or whether or not it might not be existing and there's some desire to move toward it. And so we went through a sort of a visioning and goal setting session that had a lot of different goals sort of put up on the wall. We asked that committee to then prioritize of the many goals which have been captured, and we have documentation of that, which were sort of the key or the most important in their view. And so here you see a list of some of those goals here from a prioritization standpoint. And then when we met with the new planning committee starting in 2023, we showed them these goals. We had them look at them, talk about them, with the eye of trying to determine whether or not the previous goals that had been developed by that committee were still valid or not, if they felt they needed to be changed, if some needed to be taken off or added. They did add a few goals. Here are a couple of them here at the bottom. But overall, the newer committee from 2023 felt that these goals still really stood as a good basis for discussion as they started to think about development of plan approaches. Back in 2019-2020, kind of the culmination of that work really, again, partially because of the COVID shutdown, really sort of ended with some kind of very high-level conceptual recommendations that that committee felt made sense based on the facts that they had been looking at and the discussions that they had had. And so what those high-level recommendations were is based on all of the facts they saw, that it made sense to them to consider replacing the 3 older elementary schools that you have. And the reasons for that you see listed here. There was a recognition of various types of deficiencies that they had, both programmatic, so related to educational services, but also just physical condition, with the goal of trying to align them more closely with where the district is sort of heading in some of the standards that it may have established, and particularly like the elementary level with the educational specification and so forth. And they also felt that replacing these, assuming that from a financial standpoint it made sense, provided some additional opportunities to improve sustainability, to address that educational adequacy component, so again, to try and begin to modify them to support different types of learning environments, obviously repair components, and then also take better advantage of your sites.
Same thing at the middle school. They felt that the older buildings at the middle school, the communities probably should be thinking about replacing those older buildings to bring them in alignment with the new phase one that had been constructed. And so some of the reasons for that, obviously they recognized efficiencies in those buildings. They talked about really how that campus is a little bit disjointed with regard to the old and new, just sort of a general feeling there. And the success of the phase one building, how that was a really positive thing. At the high school level, their recommendation there was, hey, you know, we don't need to do any major modernization. We don't need to do any replacement. Generally, that high school feels like it's in a good condition. However, they felt that there were definitely modernizations that could occur there, but that those modernizations were really focused around specific improvements related to programs that are ongoing at the high school level. And we'll talk about some of those specific programs a bit later. So those are really very targeted modernizations related to specific programmatic improvements. And the way that that committee had this conversation was through sort of a working session where they broke out into smaller work groups with all the facts in hand. And we posed to them various conceptual approaches that they could talk about and then report back to everyone else in the room. Obviously, one approach is you look at the facts and you say, you know what, we're in a good place. We don't really need to do anything at all. And so that's not on this chart because in some way it doesn't exist, because this is what you guys are doing every year basically right here. This is, you could relate this to your CapTech levy. These are maintenance, ongoing maintenance items that, because things wear out over time, need to be addressed. And you can see just a very short list of some of those things, like roof replacement. Roofs wear out over time, fencing repair, accessibility improvements, flooring replacement, those sorts of things. That is really supported by your CapTech levy money that's already ongoing. And you could really think of that as kind of addressing deferred maintenance or deficiencies that are happening over time. What is not included in that are some of the really major system replacements. So if you needed to go in and say replace an entire HVAC system in a building, and there are various reasons why you would undertake that, wear and tear, efficiency, and so forth. If you had to replace an entire plumbing system because the piping is, 70 years old or older or something like that, those typically are not included in this. And that is where those levels of modernization start to move into a bond related, simply because you need more capital for that. This red line represents, as you can see up here, the recognition that higher levels of modernization beyond just simple repairing deficiencies put you in a zone where you can now start to talk about aligning your facilities if you feel they need to be better aligned, which is a question, with district standards and the goals that they have set. And those two categories are major modernization, which would include up to a full modernization. And what we sort of use to define as full modernization is you're creating essentially two approaches that yield a very similar result. You would say, we have an old building, we don't want to tear it down, but we're going to modernize it so that we don't have to worry about it too much for the next 20 or 30 years, other than very, periodic deficiencies that you might see over here. So it could involve full seismic upgrades, full energy efficiency upgrades, replacing major systems, possibly, and depending on your opinion, it can also include reconfiguring internal space to better align with your educational programs, if you felt that that made sense or not. And then, of course, replacement. And what came out of this exercise is that back in 2019, 2020, we said, okay, here are these options. Go talk amongst yourselves, come back, report back to the larger group. And no one in the 2019-2020 committee, well, they felt that you should always be doing this work through the CapTech levy. But in terms of a long-range plan or a strategy, They didn't feel that this was going to be enough. In other words, you couldn't just keep doing this for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and expect the facilities to do what they said via their goals and to probably last another 50 years. So no one voted for this as a long-term approach. Roughly a little less than a third of the committee at that time felt that this is the appropriate approach, pending the cost relationship between doing that relative to just replacing the building. And slightly more than 2/3 of that group felt that this approach probably made sense for your older buildings, pending the cost relationship between these two approaches. So if this costs about as much to replace, if that's the way it ended up turning out, to do all these things, if you felt you wanted to do all these things, it may make sense to replace, but don't know.
And just really quickly on that one, my interest as a superintendent. In 2012, we contemplated taking Island Park, Lake Ridge, and West Mercer and completely rebuilding them. That bond failed for a number of different reasons, as I said earlier. But I point that out because as far back as that time, we were thinking about what's the lifespan of these schools. We kicked that down the road and we rebuilt built Northwood instead to solve a capacity issue. But my interest now, especially as a superintendent who's thinking about being good stewards of your money and your assets, is if our community is not necessarily interested in these two over here, which very well could happen, and our school board might say, now we're not gonna run a bond. We need to know that because Tony and our maintenance and operations team, we need to really prioritize the capital levy and start thinking about maximizing, because there are things that we want to do from a programmatic standpoint and an aesthetic standpoint with replacing carpets and things to some of the smaller projects. So to help us to know what to do, because if we're going to do those things, I don't want to put a bunch of this money into those schools. But if we're not, then we need to start investing capital side levy dollars. So as a superintendent, that's my self-interest in this on behalf of you and why this is important.
Right, great, thank you, Fred. Okay, so now fast forward to taking all that information that was developed by the 2019-2020 committee and bringing it forward for verification to the 2023 committee. And so we shared with them the goals, we shared with them the recommendations, asked them if, based on all the information that this 2023 committee had seen regarding all the facts, again, we had showed them the facts, did those goals and did those high-level sort of approaches of replacement and modernization of the high school make sense to them. And they felt that as a beginning point, talking about it, yes, the work of that committee should be brought forth because it did make sense, but of course there was a lot more to dig into by the new committee to sort of really understand what that meant. And so before we asked that committee to start really talking about the nitty-gritty of, hey, based on what you're seeing, what would you do, if anything, we wanted to give them more information associated with facilities and some potential projects, underscore potential projects, that had been identified and discussed in the previous committee to address some of the deficiencies or perhaps better align them with the goals that that committee had established. So we were trying to give them as much information so as they're talking about it, they can make educated plans essentially based on what they're seeing. Part of that involved cost. So because any capital plan, if there is a capital plan as part of this long-range plan, is supported by tax money, it's really important to understand cost and its relationship to taxation, because that, if you don't support it from that standpoint, again, implementation of a long-range plan, if it includes a capital plan, is not going to happen. So this chart really shows a industry standard that's tracking construction costs just over time, the Mortenson Cost Index. And we really had just shown the committee this chart to reiterate that unfortunately the sad story is that costs continue to go up. construction costs are going up. And this gives you a sense on this index of what that really looks like. So back when you're doing your previous bond, construction costs were sort of in this zone right here. And so that's middle school, Northwood sort of zone. And then when you get up to here, well, you can see what's really happening. One of the things we also did is we worked with the district and a third-party cost estimator here in the Puget Sound area and really looked at a number of current and just constructed pre-K through 12 projects and the project costs associated with those. So people could understand in 2023 dollars what to expect from the standpoint of the cost of different grade levels of construction if they were considering that as part of the plan. Okay, and that's again a big if. And so you can see what those costs are. Elementary, it's over $1,000 a square foot, same for the middle school these days. I'll talk a little bit about the logistics premium a bit later. And then of course the high school projects, they'll vary depending on what the scope of work is and the modernizations that are taking place relative to the programs. We also wanted to kind of put that in a context for that committee of something they were familiar with, which is Northwood, which came from your last bond measure, new construction. And so back in 2015, Northwood was came in at around $43 million. And fast forward now 8 years, 2023, a very similar elementary school, similar in size and sort of quality of materials and so forth, might be expected to come in around $72 million. And knowing that because we're only early in the process and just talking about what a new project might look like if you did a new project, you're not building it today. And so hypothetically, we could have picked 10 years in the future, we could have picked 8 years, we could have picked 15 years in the future. We just picked 5 years as a number. And the only point was to say, be thinking about, you're not building it today, you're doing it at some point in the future. And based on historic escalation rates, it gets very large, unfortunately. One of the other things we did before they were really talking about the planning work is we took a look at, with the third-party cost estimator, a very high-level conceptual peek at comparing a full modernization for a given elementary schools of a particular square footage, like basically if you were to, say, modernize Island Park or modernize Lake Ridge, and then compare that against the replacement cost of a similar new replacement school. And I do want to emphasize here that it was done at a higher level of detail, but you can only take that so far because obviously there's no design work that has been done. And so there's nothing as a real basis for that estimate, but it does give you what we're looking for is a high-level comparison between what it takes to fully modernize and replace. And historically, what I would share with you is that most districts that we have worked with, when they do this type of analysis, if the replacement or the full modernization of an existing building starts to approach around 70% or so of replacement cost, that's when they start to talk about, maybe we should talk about replacement. So that kind of gives you, now whether or not that's where you are, that's for you to decide because you're your own district and you have your own way of thinking about things, but that's a good way to think about where you start falling in this. So this is sort of the outcome of that analysis, which was done by this third-party estimator. And what you're looking at here is a sample replacement of a 450 student elementary and also a sample replacement of a 600 student elementary. So two options that were looked at. And then we compared those against full modernization of an existing 450, assuming a certain square footage inside. And so you can sort of see the breakouts of the various high-level conceptual pieces here on that. And really that's sort of the bottom line that we were kind of looking at. Is it falling in at, based on current conditions of the existing facility, 50% to do it, which you typically don't see that, 60, 70, 80, 90, like what is that comparison? You can see they're probably going to be pretty close. Big if you felt that a full modernization made sense versus some other types of not so full modernizations in the long haul of your school district. All right, so why is a modernization like that so expensive? There are lots of reasons here, just a few. Educational adequacy. If you felt that you wanted to modernize or reconfigure your buildings in some way to better bring them in alignment with your current ed spec, say at an elementary level, that's a great example because you just built a new elementary not long ago. That would cost a lot of money to do that because you're going in and you're taking out walls and all the finishes to do that, and that can be expensive. Another challenge could be associated with kind of land use issues, so lot coverage, impervious surface limitations, sensitive areas, which some of your sites have. That could, depending on the design of the building, it could drive you into a second story addition on some of these. It's possible. We don't know because we haven't gone to that level of analysis. But if it did, that would be quite expensive. And some of you may recognize that if you've added a second floor to your home, you probably felt that impact. Recognition that a lot of the existing systems in the building, major systems, have not been replaced already. So in the long picture of things, and with the idea that if you're going to do a full modernization, you want to come out with a product similar to replacement so that you can't quite forget it, but it's sort of taken off the tally list of a potential big problem 20 or 30 years from now. That could be done. And then finally, it could be that a lot of additional work might be triggered by the level of modernization you undertake. So that becomes a code discussion with the jurisdictions based on the amount of money you're spending, based on the size of the impact of the building. And that could involve additional seismic upgrades. It could involve bringing up the entire building to the Washington State Energy Code, which goes above and beyond the Clean Buildings Act. And of course, other stormwater treatment and accessibility improvements and so forth. So all of these things can contribute to the cost of a modernization. So looking at the potential projects then from the 2019-2020 Planning Committee and really putting the costs associated with them at the elementary level, and this is again just background for the current Planning Committee to discuss. They haven't done any work yet at this point in time. This is just tools and information for them to be talking about. They could say, no, we don't want to do any of this. We don't think it's necessary. That would be completely legitimate as far as we're concerned because that's your community's approach. So what you see here above the or on these, and I'll just look at Island Park as an example. If you were to replace Island Park, we put two size examples, a 450, a smaller elementary school. So that is in the pattern of what you have right now, smaller elementary schools. And to do that would be about $95 million or so. And that's making assumptions of when theoretical assumptions of when they might be sort of constructed, which you see that here. And there's no guarantee that that's the date. And a larger capacity, so if you were to look at building larger schools, which of course changes the number of schools. And so that would cost $121 million. There's a big cost difference between those two things. The logistics premium, and coming back to that now, what that is we would suspect, based on our experience, that if the community decided that they would like to have the new, if you were building a new building, the new building constructed on an existing site with the existing school remaining occupied. So the kids are still on the site, and there are safety concerns, considerations, and a lot of other things. You're probably going to see a logistics premium associated with that because the contractor has to work around that. They have limited delivery times, lay down stuff stored off site. It complicates things, and contractors will charge you for that logistics piece of that. Versus, say, taking the students off-site while you're constructing a new facility on that existing site, which would allow you to demo the existing building. And I would say that, and this is, again, is only in a situation where if you were replacing. So, and we're not saying you're replacing, it's if you were replacing. These are things to think about. If you did not require that site to be occupied and you saved the $3.8 million, it also provides you more opportunity with regard to the final product, because the $95 million you spend to build a new 450 student Island Park School does not have to be designed around the location of the existing building. Kind of the whole site is your oyster. You can use that and design the best building to sit there for 7 years that you can. So that's just something to think about. Below the or, if you do not replace a school, some of the schools really warrant consideration of other work that you can do. So there's the Clean Buildings Act. If you don't replace Island Park, you should probably consider putting some money into it to align with the Clean Buildings Act, because if you don't, in a couple of years, the state will start fining you, basically. And there are other possible things you might do. So in the case of Island Park, possibly you might consider for safety reasons or other to connect the two buildings there. Not saying you should do that, it's up to you, but if you are interested in connecting them, that's the dollar figure. So you can sort of see across the way. We did similar for Islander Middle School, replacement of the older buildings here. The track and field is really only on there because if you were to replace those, you may have to find a temporary home for those students. If the design were on the location of those existing buildings, that temporary location could be on the track and field. The contractor's laydown of material, all the construction material, could also be on the track and field. If that were to be the case, you have to fix the track and field, basically. So that's what that dollar figure is about. If you don't build a new school, you might consider connecting the new buildings. You might consider connecting them, not say that you do, but that there is a cost. And then Islander High School, here's a list of some of the things programmatically, it's not comprehensive, that could be addressed through discussions we have had with staff and so forth, and money associated with those programmatic modernizations. Crest Learning Center, you see there are some projects, and then the admin building considerations. Must do there, no replacement of course, but there's some ADA's accessibility. So there's some accessibility things there that should be addressed, some life safety improvements, and then some optional projects as well. So now the committee is doing planning work, or getting ready to do planning work.
And so additional information that we're looking at with thinking about your tax dollars and what that looks like for you, we also want to keep in mind, as we said, do we stack our bonds together if we're thinking about a bond and put one on top of the other, or do we let one expire and then run another one? So this is showing tax rates that come based on the school district. Our EP&O levy, which is the gray, that's our enrichment programs and operations levy. You can see it was volatile for a while and then it leveled out. What happened there was the McCleary decision in 2016, which changed the funding model. We can now only collect a certain number. It's based on our students, so it's a much more predictable number, because in theory, the state has taken up more. Your tax bill going to the state is much higher than it was back in 2015-16. So there's been this reversal. And so that's why you're looking at this saying, Fred, my tax bill looks very different than that. Mine does too. That's simply because we're collecting less at the local level. The state is collecting more from the state. The next bar there is their capital tech levy. That's our levy that we've been talking about that helps us to sustain our technology, but also make improvements. Then we have kind of the blue bar up on the top there, or that third row. That's our existing debt. That's the bond from the 2013-2014 levy. And then you see the periodic orange. Those are transportation levies. When you run a transportation levy, you just collect all the money at once, and then you use that over time to purchase new vehicles. So this is what kind of the tax forecast is kind of looking like, and why we're thinking about, okay, now is also a time from an economic standpoint in terms of our loans, is this the time to potentially look at taking out another loan in the form of a bond and then rebuilding buildings.
Okay.
Go to the next one. This is a historical piece. Some of you may have been around for all of this, and some of you may be new to the community, and you may have entered in somewhere closer towards the end, but it's always important, and we wanted our committee and we want you to see kind of the history of our school district. Back down here in the 70s, that's when our district was at its height. We had 5 elementary schools at one point, we had 2 junior high schools, and we had 1 high school. And that's because when they built that I-90 bridge, we all of a sudden saw the massive escalation in construction and new homes and new families moving to Mercer Island. And then their kids were now starting to go through the schools. At that same time, obviously, the city was building infrastructure as well. And some of that infrastructure, as my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. yesterday morning, that transportation was going to be disrupted on West Mercer Way because there was a water main break. We're all facing some of those challenges as we go through. But as we were moving through the 70s, we closed our first school or moved students out of it. That was our East Mercer School, which became the Boys and Girls Club on West Mercer before it moved to the Peak. But more significantly, as the decline started happening, largely because of the Boeing bust and the economic conditions of the Puget Sound region, Mercer View Elementary, which was right here on this piece of land that the community center was built on, we closed that in around 1980. We closed our North Mercer Junior High campus, which is where Northwood is now, in 1979-ish, or excuse me, 1981-ish. By 1982, Mercer Crest Elementary, which was right on the site where Crest Learning Center and the Boys and Girls Club is right now, that was closed. Interestingly, those schools were built in around 1950 and only had a life of about 30 years. I use that as an indicator to say the decisions we make, we are going to do the very best that we don't wind up in a situation where our schools only have such a short lifespan. We want our schools to last a long time, whether or not we're building or renovating and keeping them. We then reconfigured the schools. We went to the the K-5, the 6-8, and the 9-12 model. And then in the mid-90s is when we started renovations. That was that graph earlier with the black and green bars. So it kind of shows where we started renovating. We saw a rebound in our students. We stayed pretty flat. We had a small dip in around 2006 and 7 because of the recession. So we lost some students there. And then we've been on an incline all the way up until we hit COVID. Interestingly, we did some more renovations, but you can see when Northwood opened, another thing happened that we did not predict and we didn't know was going to happen, and that is birth rates in King County. Birth rates across the state, birth rates across the nation started dropping, but mainly in King County from 2016, and it's continued every year. There's been fewer and fewer births in King County. Obviously, that's an impact on our new enrollment and our kindergartners, which is what we're starting to see now. The sudden drop there, kind of that slip fault earthquake kind of moment, was COVID, where we lost 250-ish students. Some went to private schools, some moved out of state, some went to other locations where they had homes and enrolled, some went online. You can see the drop there, and then you can see kind of where we are today. If we narrow in and take a look at our demographers in the past, the blue line there are demographic studies. There wasn't a lot of volatility for a while after the recession. Things were fairly predictable, and our demographers were right on with where our schools were. We then had our demographic study right before COVID. That was for the Long Range Facility Planning Committee in 1920. But the projections there, though it was showing a slight decline, had to be completely redone because obviously that was the COVID drop. And our new enrollment projection, taking the two demographic studies together, you can kind of see what we're projecting now. If we narrow in on our elementary school, I think it's important to note that, again, that kind of where we are now is where we think we're going to be for the next decade. And that poses some great opportunities for us to have predictability. It also poses some opportunities to be thinking about our schools, and we'll get into that in a moment. And so just kind of circling back, this is why this enrollment versus capacity question comes into our minds, and that is, if we think our projections are going to be fairly stable, then are our current conditions, the way we're using our schools, the way we're staffing our schools, is that what's going to be best for the long term? Or might we consider other option? And that's why consolidation started to become a conversation. And I'll get into that again in a little bit. So I'm going to turn it back to Leroy now, because we're going to talk about, the committee had all of this information. And then we started asking them important questions around, so what if? What should we do? If the committee, and we had all decided that, yes, we should do something with our schools, what might that look like? And we allowed them to start working on that.
Great, I'm good there. Thank you.
You can have two.
Double mic, yeah. Okay, yeah, so, and we did that by just asking kind of just 3 really simple questions. And the first question was really just a watershed question. You know, based on all the information that they have seen, all the facts associated with the facility condition, which you've only had a slight glimpse at, the age, the programs, all of that, and putting that in the context of a longer-term strategic thinking for the district, and also whatever goals and objectives and values they wanted to layer onto that from the viewpoint of Mercer Islanders. Do you think that anything needs to be done, particularly anything that would require capital, money, taxation, a bond? If the group would have said collectively, no, we think actually it can be handled by deferred maintenance kind of approaches, we would have, that's the end of the conversation. We would have been able to stop right there and say, okay, that makes sense. We would bring that out to you and say, this is what the group felt, and their plan is thinking moving on with just deferred maintenance, and then hear from you. They did not say that. Really across the board, they said, no, it appears to us that we should really be thinking about doing something moving forward in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, because you don't want to get to a point 40 years from now where if things are in very bad condition, you have a lot of things that are in bad condition, and it can be very expensive at that point in time to try to address multiple projects. So we then ask them, if your answer is yes, what should be done? What are your priorities? And how much should be done? What do you think is really going to be tolerated by the community? Because anything that involves capital is going to create taxation pain, basically, right? No one wants to pay higher taxes. I know I certainly don't want to pay higher taxes. But at the same time, you have to maintain this institution. How much of it do you want to bite off, basically? So we broke that committee over the course of several meetings into small group work groups, so that they, similar to the 2019-2020 committee, could, as the small groups work, talk about, think about, and develop whatever they felt made sense to them. Thinking about the project options, they could have put up their own project options, I suppose, if they wanted to. And all of the discussions and information that had been shared. 2 of those groups ended up landing with a scenario that looked basically like this. It was one of the 2 sort of larger capital approaches. This one involved really considering, in that approach, replacing the older middle school buildings and an elementary school. Okay, and they identified Lake Ridge, but I think it's fair to say that you could just say, thinking about replacing an elementary school. Whether or not Lake Ridge is the right one is sort of another question, I think. The bigger initial question is, do you want to go that far and replace some elementary school and the older middle school buildings? They also included, as did all of the groups, you'll see, a percentage, and they all included very similar percentages, right around 40%, for program-related improvements or modernizations at the high school. And then various other projects too were tacked on. We put these in smaller text because they're not huge contributors to the overall cost, but there are additional monies in there. So I will say one like mandatory project might be for projects that were not being replaced. That could involve things like alignment with the Clean Buildings Act, the State Clean Buildings Act. So here you see the implication, and you'll see this on all 4 of these schemes, of what the implication of that size of bond is to your taxes. So 59 cents per thousand of assessed value, and then we gave this multiplier because it'll be easier for you to do your own personal calculation. That equates to roughly $49 a month increase per $1 million of assessed value. So you can kind of do the math based on whatever your assessment is and get a sense of what the hit for that size of a bond would be if you're thinking, yeah, it does make sense to undertake that much work. So 2 of the groups kind of landed on that. One of the groups landed on this approach, which was looking at, instead of replacing the remaining older middle school buildings, they felt for various reasons that it made more sense to look at replacing 2 elementaries at one time. And again, they put names on these elementaries. However, what I would say is, it's good to be thinking at a higher level, big approach of, is a 2 elementary replacement approach a good idea, regardless of what the names are? We can discuss what specific names are later at the time. That could certainly shift. Then you'll see they also included basically the same percentage of high school improvements after discussing back and forth with the group. And here you can see the impact down here of that tax. So it's slightly more, $52 instead of, I think it was $49 per month, based on $1 million of assessed value. And Fred, if I'm missing something, go ahead and chime in, please. Another group, as they talked about it, they said, you know, basically we think that large of a bond is too much. That's too much. The community is not going to support it. It just costs too much. So what we really recommend is looking at an approach that looks at only replacing the older middle school buildings. You know, biting off a smaller chunk, moving forward, getting some work done. But this is where we would recommend putting the effort if we were to consider this. So here you see that. Again, they did apply the programmatic improvements at the high school and then the other smaller mandatory projects. You can see the shift in the bond. It goes down to $144 million. And that equates to about $36 a month per $1 million of assessed value, so replacing the middle schools. And then as we got together as a group and talked about it more, a 4th option popped up, which is looking at only replacing 1 elementary school. Again, whichever one name could be picked at some point in time would have to be identified, obviously, at some point. And so here you see in this instance the $160 million bond, and you're looking at around $37 per month per $1 million of assessed value. And so we felt that it was really important to always keep all of this information in front of the planning committee as they were discussing it, because their decisions, whether it meant we're not going to do anything to, oh, we're going to shoot the moon and do a lot, had real implication cost-wise that was either going to be supported or it was not going to be supported. And so we wanted to have those difficult conversations in view of the things they were thinking about. So here you see all 4 of those kind of stacked up against each other. These are not in any way complete. We do not get the feeling that we're bringing complete approaches here. What we want to hear from you is, if everyone in this room said, you know, after seeing all of this, and we appreciate what the planning committee did, we don't think any replacement should be done. Okay, we want to hear that from you, right? Because again, if you don't support this, that's really, really critical. Conversely, if one of these made a huge amount of sense to you, and we can learn that from you, we would love to learn that. Which one makes most sense, if any of these, or some version of them. We do want to note that each plan that included in an elementary contemplates, but it does not require consolidation. And I want to make this very, very clear. So the groups that we're talking about this, you can see we're exploring the idea of building larger elementary schools, so 600 student elementary schools. The concept moving forward of what you want to do with your facilities is not driven by that in any way. You could just as well replace those blue boxes with 450 student elementary schools. And what I'm saying is, if this community felt really strongly that from the use of your public monies, it made sense to continue with the smaller schools, that can be done within the idea of replacement of your schools over time. The district and the board would just need to hear that. Conversely, if you had a strong feeling that it made sense to build larger schools within this, they want to hear that too. Okay, either way. You'll notice, and that's really just sort of talking about this point, and then the further one is just noting again that if these were pursued with a smaller school, the cost of all these would go down because you're building a smaller school. And this slide just sort of shows that all of this conversation was done within the context of the longer term. You can think of this as sort of a phase one. And to state the obvious, the more you do in phase one, the less that is left in the future for you to go back at some point in time and address. Smaller projects in phase one, you just need to realize that there will be more of a series at some point in the future, don't know when, of projects that you'll need to come back and talk about at some point in time. And so we then kind of put the screws to the facility planning committee and say, great, you've done this work, you've developed these approaches, this is kind of what you're thinking makes sense. Now, are they all equal to you? Remembering that none of them are cast in stone, and we're not asking them to identify the one that's moving forward. What we wanted to be able to do is come out to you and share with you whether or not, the committee felt that all of them were equal. They don't know from one to the other what makes the most sense. But what we found, or what they told us, was vote personally for themselves as an individual voter, knowing what they now knew about the facilities. 13 votes, most of the votes, landed on going for a bigger bond. That's from their personal standpoint. But we also asked them, that's great, but what do you think the community would realistically support? And when it came down to that, they were thinking a smaller bond was probably going to be what would make sense. And they actually felt that it would likely be replacing the older buildings at the middle school because it's a smaller bond, but that might be the way to go. And we're only showing these again because we're not saying, okay, these are the two, pick from these two. We're only showing you these so that you can see what your community members thought about and discussed, and use that as a way to get feedback from you, even if that feedback is, I don't like either one of those. Okay, so that's what we're after here. And these were just some of the reasons of why people voted the way they voted. And I'll just leave that up there for about 30 seconds so you can just kind of take a quick look at them. Hopefully they're legible. And there were other reasons too, because we were curious, well, why did you vote this way? And so here's just a sampling of some of the thoughts behind it. Okay?
So up until now, it really has been about, bonds and what that looks like. But I now want to shift our attention to school consolidation, which didn't even begin as a conversation at the beginning of the committee's work. It wasn't on anyone's mind in 2019, 2020. And it wasn't on the committee's mind when we first started working in those early months. But as we started showing the new demographics and we started taking a look at some other things, we had to take a look and go down the path. I want to remind everyone again of these principles that I shared at the beginning, and that is nothing has been decided. School consolidation, we could have made that decision a year ago, we could wait 10 years, and we could choose never to do it. So nothing has been decided in terms of this. It's been contemplated, and I'll talk about for very good reasons in my opinion. So we also know that this is a community process, and that this community, unlike the ones that I currently live in or the one I grew up in, has people move back to their schools more than I've ever seen. We have families who are multi-generational here on Mercer Island, and a lot of communities don't benefit from that. We have parents who are at Island Park with their kids there because they went there. We have parents who are at Lake Ridge who went to Lake Ridge and now their kids are there. And that's one of the great attributes of our community. But there were a couple things happening that make, I think, exploring consolidation important at this time. And I'm not here to say that, yes, Fred Rundle believes we should consolidate or that we shouldn't. But I am here to say that I think it's on me and it's on our school district to at least give you all the variables that are at play. Because these buildings are a lot of money. They're a lot of money to operate, and they're some of your most expensive assets on the island. So obviously with demographics changing, and we have schools that aren't as large anymore, we have to look at efficiencies. Some of those efficiencies have to do with the number of administrators or nurses that we need or custodians. And when you run 3 schools versus 4, those change. I received many notes at the beginning of this school year with parents concerned about combination classes. And we have more combination classes now, which means we have 3rd, 4th graders together or 1st and 2nd graders together than at any time when I've been in the district. And people are concerned about that, but there are things that are causing that I want to talk about there. We obviously have facility conditions. We have budget challenges that we're continuing to rebound from. When I started as superintendent a year ago, we owed $2 million to ourselves that we had to borrow from our cap tech levy to put into our general fund. We had a fund balance of just over $1 million, but when we owed $2 million to ourselves, you could argue that we were in the hole. Later on this month, we'll be taking to the board our new forecast. I'm pleased to say we should be around 3.5% fund balance, and we'll be looking to grow that to 5% by the end of the year. We need about 8 to 10% of fund balance to feel more comfortable so that we can make payroll for 2 months in a row and keep our district going. We have to continue to think about our budget too in light of challenges. And then the final one that I just want to point out there is the regional conversations that are taking place. Bellevue School District closed down 2 schools last spring. It was in the news quite a bit. And I think from some people's perspective that happened extremely quickly. It was jarring, and some of you may have friends or family who have kids that were in those 2 schools. We also know Seattle's going through a similar process. And I was just on the phone, though I won't disclose the school district, with another school district similar to us that will be starting a similar conversation in the coming weeks. I say that because our committee was not operating in a vacuum. These things were happening around, there were conversations, and so to at least bring this up and to say what's at play, I think is important. When we look historically then, and I start thinking about our enrollment in our elementary schools over time, right before Northwood opened, we were almost at 1,900 elementary students. A lot of those students are now into our high school or they've graduated out, which is why we have pretty large graduating classes right now. We graduated out about 370 seniors last spring. We replaced them with 187 kindergartners. We've always had a delta between the number of incoming kindergartners, but that delta is greater than it's been in many, many years. And so we're thinking about those demographic trends. But you can see we had 3 really full schools, and when we opened up Northwood, we were able to disperse those students, disperse the staff, and create those smaller learning communities. But as we've gone through and we start looking at the implications of declining birth rates because of COVID and other factors, we are now sitting with schools that we didn't think would be this small at this point in time. And so back to this slide here, the good news is we don't think that it's going to get much smaller, but it's not going to get much larger either based on the demographic projections. And so going to this slide here then, if I was back in high school and I was in a debate class or I was on the debate team, I could easily debate either side of this. Both of these sides are true. It's true we need 3 schools. It's true we need 4 schools. And let me talk about that a little bit. 3 schools, much like other organizations, when you're thinking about economies of scale, they have some benefits. We've gone through some painful process of reducing our librarians in our elementary schools. That's not a fun process, and I received plenty of feedback from families who are frustrated about that. But when we go from schools once upon a time that had 600, 580 students in them, and now all of a sudden we have schools that have 350, we don't have the number of students who are generating the need for all of that. And so when you have some of those smaller schools with 4 smaller schools, it makes it harder, but those 3 schools, that's a benefit. On the other side, when you have those larger schools, you've got more kids in them. You don't have that smaller field that we have in our 4 elementary schools now. Some of you I see in the audience today, you were at Lake Ridge with me, or you were in some of our schools, you felt that impact of when we had portables everywhere. And so we do have that smaller feel right now. On the other side, if we run 3 schools, we have about an $800,000 savings. Savings in utilities, savings in custodial staff, savings in nurses and health rooms and upkeep. And for some people, that's a lot of money. And that right there is reason to do it. And for others, it's not worth the churn. Because if we go to the other side, you start creating unpredictable situations for families who have moved into a community and feel like I get to walk to school, my kid's not on a bus, and now all of a sudden if we're closing schools, those variables start to change. On the other side over here, taking a look at, as Leroy was saying, I'll point out swing space. We don't have another space. We don't own more property that we can just build on. We sold some of it, I'm sure for very good reasons at the time. I won't second guess boards or superintendents at those times. But when we don't have a place to build another school, we have to start thinking about if we are going to change an elementary school, we're going to rebuild a school, we've got to do something, and there will be impact on our students somewhere along the way. And I think the last thing, if we don't change and consolidate, then we're not changing our boundaries. And changing boundaries is a challenging process. We went through that when we built Northwood, and you're talking about families having to move to new schools. So there are pros and cons to both of these, and I think both of them are true. And I'm not here to say as a superintendent that we should do one or the other right now. What I am here to say is this is what's at play, and I'd really like to hear from you because I think our school board wants to hear, and we want to make a good decision.
Thank you so much for watching our video and our webinar from one of our 3 community events that we hosted this past week. I'm back in my office today after some wonderful experiences, being able to share long-range facility planning ideas that our community members who are part of the committee came up with. And now it's your time to provide feedback. So after watching the webinar today, what I invite you to do is in a moment, you're going to get a screen with a QR code, and that QR code is going to take you to a survey. The survey will remain open for a period of time to give all of our community members a chance to participate. So in a moment, you'll see the QR code. Please respond to that survey, and then we'll be taking all of the results from this survey as well as feedback that we've received during this process, providing a more comprehensive report back to our school board, and then next steps will be provided for the long-range facility planning. I know it was a long webinar, so thanks for watching, and thanks for helping to provide feedback.